Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're not just looking at animal fashion. We're figuring out where the taste for that fashion actually came from, and it turns out it all starts with an empty stomach. Okay, let's unpack this. We're zooming in on one of the most fundamental questions in evolutionary biology. Why animals look the way they do. The peacock's tail, the complex songs, the bright colors. And we're focused on the sensory bias hypothesis, which is basically the idea that these big ornamental traits, the bright, attention-grabbing signals, they evolve because they're exploiting a sensory preference that was already hardwired into the observer.
It's the ultimate evolutionary shortcut, really. The observer, and it's usually the female, already likes certain colors or shapes for a totally different reason.
Like finding food.
Exactly, finding food or maybe avoiding predators. So a male who, just by chance, evolves a trait that mimics that preferred cue gets this massive leg up in the mating game.
He just has to look like a floating snack or something.
Right. And the traditional view of sensory bias has been almost exclusively focused on this kind of sexual selection. We see a female preference driving the evolution of a really striking male sexual trait.
You see this in guppies, right?
Guppies are the classic example. Pocilia reticulata. The males have these brilliant, distinctive red dot patterns, and they evolved those patterns because female guppies already spend their lives hunting for red-colored fruits that fall into the water. So that foraging preference for red just got hijacked.
The guppy male basically dressed up as a desirable berry.
Precisely. Or, take the Goodea species of fish. The males developed these bright yellow tail bands. Well, that signal evolved because the females had a pre-existing, really strong visual sensitivity for foraging on yellow worms. So if you think of natural selection as just survival, this is the twist. Sometimes evolution selects for traits that are just good at tricking the senses.
So the rule has generally been, pre-existing sensory wiring, often for finding food, gets co-opted for mating. But here's the interesting curveball in the research we've analyzed. What if this bias isn't just about sexual attraction?
What if it's not just one sex driving the trait in another?
Exactly. What if it's about a trait that's shared by both sexes? And this shifts our focus entirely to something called mutual ornamentation flashy traits found in both males and females.
Which brings us to our subjects.
Our subjects for today? A beautiful family of birds, the estrildid finches or waxbills. And get this is the staggering fact that demanded this deep dive. About 25% of the 134 known estrildid species have evolved these really conspicuous white dot plumage patterns.
And crucially, in a huge number of those species, both the male and the female have them. They are sharing the polka dot fashion.
They're both rocking the docks.
They are. And this changes the game for the sensory bias hypothesis. If the bias is truly ancestral and non-sexual, meaning it existed before the ornament itself, it should explain shared traits, not just competitive ones.
So what was the mission here?
The goal of this major multi-species study was simple: to test if a pre-existing non-sexual sensory bias in the ancient common estrildid ancestor could be the engine that drove the evolution of these widespread shared white dot patterns we see today. We're basically asking if a hunger-related survival instinct became a shared fashion statement.
Okay, so to answer that, the researchers face that fundamental hurdle in any evolutionary study. How do you test the brain of an ancestor?
Right. You can't. Ideally, you'd test the finch common ancestor itself, but behavioral experiments on fossils are a little bit off the table.
So you can't interview Grandpa Finch about his favorite visual patterns. How do you solve that problem?
You use what we call phylogenetic comparative methods. This is where you rely on the living cousins to reconstruct what the grandfather must have been like.
Oh, okay.
The crucial premise is that if the preference for white dots is truly ancestral, we're talking millions of years old, it has to be shared across the current species, whether or not they have the dots today.
So if you find that even the finches, who are plain-looking, still prefer dots,
then that suggests the preference is older than the ornament itself. It came first.
So they basically mapped current behaviors onto the evolutionary family tree. It's like gathering evidence from 12 separate living relatives to build a cognitive profile of the common ancestor.
Exactly. And the source notes this is a vital step that a lot of previous studies just skipped. If you only test a few species, you might assume a preference is recent or unique to that one lineage.
Right.
By using this tree method, they avoid biasing the estimate of that ancient state. They had to prove the preference wasn't just a byproduct of having the dots now. The preference had to come first.
Okay, let's get into the actual experiment. They recruited 12 species of adult estrildid finches.
A robust sample,
Yeah.
95 individuals in total.
And it covered all the major genera, including the famous zebra finches, the beautiful star finches, and the red-cheeked cordon bleus. They were trying to get a really wide snapshot of the whole family. And to isolate the core visual bias, they had to keep the test simple.
Right.
They created these simple, monochromatic, printed stimuli. White dots, 2 millimeters in diameter, versus white stripes, 2 millimeters wide.
It was intentional minimalism. They wanted to minimize the influence of prior experience. They didn't want the birds looking at something that reminded them of a specific flower or, a nest material.
They just wanted to tap into that raw, intrinsic visual preference.
Exactly. And the experimental design was brilliant in its simplicity. They just measured the visual preference using gazing frequency.
So how much time the birds spent looking at the dots versus the stripes?
Yep. And they did this over 2 separate days, under 2 different conditions.
Okay, so day 1.
Day 1 was the high-stakes test, the food-deprived condition. This was designed to test for a preference that is directly linked to survival and hunger.
And day 2.
Day 2 was the control, the food-supplied condition. This tests for a hunger-neutral or maybe a pure intrinsic preference.
What was the specific prediction that tied hunger to dots in the first place?
Well, what's fascinating here is the foraging context. Estrildid species are primarily granivores, so they eat small seeds.
Right.
But some of them also eat whitish, round invertebrates found on the ground, things like termites or ant eggs. So the prediction was very precise. If this visual bias is truly related to ancestral foraging, the finches should show a significantly stronger preference for the round objects, the white dots, when their survival urgency is highest.
When they are hungry.
Exactly. Hunger in this test acts as the volume knob for that ancestral foraging imperative.
And when they turned up that volume knob, the results were pretty striking.
Definitive, really.
Across all 12 species, the finches generally preferred the white dots to the stripes. But here's where it gets really interesting, confirming that survival link. In the full analysis, the finches showed a significant preference for white dots only under that high-stakes food-deprived condition.
Only on day 1, when they were hungry.
Exactly.
The exact number here is the story. When they were hungry, the estimated proportion of their gaze response toward those dots was about 61.5%.
So a clear majority.
A very clear majority. They were literally hardwired to prioritize the dots when their stomach was empty. That 61.5% is the statistical proof that this visual bias is deeply, deeply associated with searching for food.
It confirms the premise then.
Yeah.
They're seeking round, white objects.
Which would represent either grain seeds, their staple food, or those small, whitish, round invertebrates they hunt. When survival is on the line, the dot pattern becomes the most conspicuous, attractive visual element in their world.
That strong lean towards the dots when hungry provides that link to survival.
But
Let's talk about the nuance of the food-supplied condition on day 2 when they weren't hungry. Using the full data set, the preference was not statistically significant.
right.
Does that mean the bias just disappears when they're full?
Not quite. And this is where the depth of the study really shines. A separate, more focused analysis on a subset of the species did still show a significant preference even when they were fed. It clocked in at 59.0%.
Wait, okay, so 61.5% when hungry, but still 59.0% even when they're full. What does that difference tell us?
It suggests there's an underlying intrinsic visual preference for dots, a sort of foundational cognitive state that exists regardless of hunger.
A baseline preference.
A baseline, exactly. Think of it like a built-in psychological attraction, like you might always prefer a certain shape, but that preference is dramatically amplified or prioritized when the bird is under caloric stress. The foraging drive turns that intrinsic dot preference into a life-or-death survival tool.
And crucially, they ruled out any modern factors that could confuse the finding. They showed that this preference for dots was not significantly affected by whether a species currently eats termites.
Or, and this is key, whether the species currently possesses the white dot plumage pattern itself.
That's the critical step for proving ancestry, isn't it?
It is. If current diet doesn't matter and current feather pattern doesn't matter, it proves the preference is ancient. It predates the trait itself and is shared across the entire family tree. That makes it a true ancestral sensory bias.
So this raises the biggest question of all. If current diet and plumage don't explain the preference, how far back does it go?
Now we return to those sophisticated phylogenetic comparative methods. They used what's called ancestral state reconstruction to infer the cognitive reality of the common ancestor.
So we're using the data from the living birds to build that ancient cognitive profile. What did the analysis reveal about the ancestor's mind?
The analysis indicated that the hunger-related visual preference for white dots was highly likely present in the estrildid common ancestor.
Highly likely. Could they put a number on that?
They can. They were able to put a definitive probability on it. The likelihood of the root node, the deepest ancestor having this preference, was estimated at 62.2%. That's very strong evidence that this bias is millions of years old.
And this 62.2% probability of the preference existing in the ancestor is then contrasted with the finding that the ancestor was unlikely to have had the white dot plumage pattern itself.
There it is.
So we have the definitive sequence. The preference for the polka dot came first, way before the actual dot signal evolved on the feathers.
And if that wasn't enough, they confirmed the gender component. They found no statistically significant difference in visual preference toward the dots between males and females.
So the ancestral bias is fundamentally shared. It's not a male or female thing.
It's a finch thing.
So what does this all mean for evolutionary theory? Let's synthesize this. The common ancestral finch was intrinsically programmed to seek out small, round, white objects because that meant food. That's the 61.5% survival priority.
Right.
Then, when later generations of finches evolved a white dot plumage pattern, a true polka dot look, this pre-existing shared visual bias made those dots immediately conspicuous, attractive, and evolutionarily successful as social signals in both sexes.
This is the paradigm shift. This finding is pioneering because it's really the first time the sensory bias hypothesis has been explored so rigorously in avian signaling traits that are shared between sexes. It takes the theory out of the realm of pure sexual competition.
And moves it into social evolution.
Exactly. It moves it firmly into the realm of general social evolution. It gives us a powerful mechanism to explain the existence of mutual ornamentation.
And the resulting dot patterns, therefore, serve these crucial functions that go way beyond just mate choice. If the pattern is equally attractive to all finches because of their ancient appetite, then those dots might be critical for efficient social organization.
I think so. For example, they could play a huge role in species recognition.
Right, helping them find their own kind.
Helping finches rapidly identify their own kind within large, noisy, mixed species flocks where visual cues are absolutely essential. Or, perhaps more simply, those conspicuous dots might just facilitate the detection of other members of their species at far distances, making flocking easier.
The ancient foraging bias became the foundation for modern avian communication, for social cohesion.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's pull back and summarize this fascinating deep dive. We started with the traditional view of sensory bias, a female preference driving male fashion like the red dots on the guppy. But we applied that same theory to the estrildid finches and their mutual ornamentation, their shared white dot plumage. And the genius of the researcher was connecting a cognitive state to an ancestor, showing that an ancient shared hunger-related preference for white dots was already present.
A preference demonstrated by that significant 61.5% gaze preference when the birds were hungry.
The key takeaway for you listening to this is really the aha moment that changes how we view animal signals. Evolution doesn't always start with romance. A basic shared foraging necessity for small, round, white seeds or insects in an ancestral bird paved the entire evolutionary pathway for this shared, flamboyant, ornamental fashion, the white polka dot in millions of modern finches.
The need for food literally dictates the runway.
I like that.
Now, this study is incredibly powerful because it combines those phylogenetic methods with really rigorous behavioral tests. However, it did rely entirely on simple, abstract white dot and stripe patterns as stimuli.
Which leaves a tantalizing question hanging, doesn't it? Given how amazing bird vision is, their acuity and color vision, what if the stimuli were more lifelike?
Exactly, and that's the final thought for you to explore. What would further investigations, using stimuli that more closely mimic actual food sources, like round, whitish seeds versus long, thin, colored worms, or introducing specific color variations, what would that reveal about the precise nature of the estrildid's intrinsic visual world?
Would we find even deeper layers of that ancestral bias?
Maybe. We could find that the ancestral appetite for the polka dot is even more specific and more deeply ingrained than we currently realize.